Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hi, you are. I'm Candice Hopkins. I'm a writer and a curator, and I'm joining you today from Albuquerque, New Mexico, where I live. But I'm originally from the Yukon Territory. I'm Tlingit from Carcross-Tagish First Nation. Cross is actually short for Caribou Crossing. And I was born in a small city in the north called Whitehorse. And Joar and I have been in dialogue for a long time. I first heard of his work through some people who were traveling through Tromsø. And then we really worked together closely for Documental 14 as part of a project called European Everything. And as someone whose practice has inspired me, I think that there's a lot of through lines in what we'll talk about today, and I'll bring some of those forward. But really, it's an honor to be here to speak with you, Joar, to have this ongoing dialogue that certainly shaped my thinking, particularly around ideas of architecture, mobility, colonialism, for example, and understanding how these histories, I think, have certain intersections, but also really divergent, depending on, our own experiences of history and how we live now. So, Joar, I wanted to begin with this dialogue that we started having in the spring. We were talking about, going back to your collaborative project on indigenuity. We were talking about how it could be something of a lexicon, or understanding it as a shared vocabulary, and how I think of that as a kind of vocabulary of practices and ideas that are always being honed, tested, shaped, shared. And they're things that are developed in collaboration with the local conditions, local materials, local knowledges, even when that local might be defined by perpetual motion. So I was kind of curious, given that you've been thinking about this idea for a long time, whether anything has changed for you now, whether, this definition still holds, whether it's still something, valuable to think about, and how you've used it in this current exhibition in Bergen.
That's a good question. I guess my thoughts around what we now speak about as indigenuity, I think about it as an attitude that you find in indigenous communities, this ability to sort of think resourceful about material and the flow of materials, about solving problems there and then when the problem occurs with whatever you have at hand. That sort of attitude that me and Silja Figenschou-Thoresen coined the indigenuity attitude. It's actually started a little bit earlier than that, and it started as a part of my investigation on the vernacular architecture of my Sami home communities, especially around Masi and Godgeino. I realized that there was this kind of competence of improvisation, and that's actually a coin that I also picked up through a conversation with another Sami philosopher, you could say, Anders Zombie. He was using that term that I don't know if it was deliberate or not, but it popped out of his mouth, that the Sami competence of improvisation, and that's already 15 years ago. So it has stuck with me for those years, and it started as Sami competence of improvisation, and then it became indigenuity, which is something that's it goes from being a bit more sort of local and geographically kind of contained by the Sami perspective, and tries to, through the use of indigenuity term, become more international maybe, and more dealing with an indigenous sort of global perspective. Because I found this same sort of design attitudes in the backyards in different reserves that I visited as well in Canada, especially on the East Coast. I went and I had did a lot of visits in the Mi'kmaq areas in the Atlantic region of Canada. And there I saw and I found a lot of similarities. So it started to expand already then, just a few years later, becoming something that I thought about as more international. And thinking about sort of where I am today in relation to that sort of that definition, I think that it has become some sort of maybe almost like a backbone of my whole artistic practice. It's something that at one point was like really looking at, observing a bit, maybe through photography and text, a bit like an anthropologist would do maybe. I guess I now am dealing with these same sort of attitudes in a much more personally embedded way, if that's the right word to use. But I'm trying to really incorporate it into my architectural praxis, and I'm maybe more interested in actually using it as a tool, as an energy in creating and building, more than sort of observing it and lifting it up as something, some sort of a cultural phenomena. I'm more interested in it in a spatial sense. I'm more interested in it as a tool within my design practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that you struck on some things that I've been thinking about with regards to that idea. One is the kind of use of materials often against their original purpose, which to me has this sense of autonomy, or even like you could consider indigenous sovereignty into that. And you've called that a kind of material irony. For me, it's also, this sense of innovation has a kind of subversion to it. And, last time we were talking about the ability not only to use things against their intended purpose, but how that can be a kind of anti-colonial act too, or even like an anti-capitalist act. Because one of the features, I think, of indigenuity as well is always kind of reusing. And I think that this is probably what you saw when you were traveling on the east coast of Canada too. And I see this all throughout the north, is this kind of repurposing, and how that kind of attitude is that, anything, it's actually seeing everything as potential, which I think is a kind of fascinating, position to be in. And I think through this, from what I saw, is the sense of that migration becomes a kind of motive, whether that's also the migration of materials, a kind of extreme capacity of improvising with location, improvising with limited resources, recycling ideas, kind of being inventive and solving problems on the spot. And in that sense, this kind of autonomy or autonomous cultural dimensions are created through adaptations. And in that, what I think is really interesting about what you do too is you're always kind of attracted to the borders or the peripheries as a way of challenging what those borders are. And when we worked on Documenta 14, one of the most important parts of that project, which is part of the Bergen show, was actually the travel that you did. And you chose a very particular route. You drove, all the way from Tromsø to Athens, but along the edges of what you might define as Europe. And sometimes I think that these edges, when you're there, it actually gives you a better perspective of how you might define the center. But as you were traveling around these edges, you also were not only gathering things, you were kind of gathering people, and a lot of those people were tool builders. So I was kind of curious about if you could share more about that process and what you were seeing at that time, which was a time, I would say, when Europe was in crisis because of economic depression, of material flows. So certain materials, once again, were taking on different values. And then you chose to locate yourself within a scrapyard, which is really the epicenter of those flows. And you lived there for a number of months, sort of not only observing, but sort of making and sort of seeing how things how I think different value systems were emerging. So yeah, I was hoping you could share a little bit more about that, because you see, you know, some of the traces of that project in Bergen, but I think that the journey was one of the most important parts.
Mm. No, definitely. I think the starting point for that journey was, well, obviously it was my big red Mercedes Sprinter, which I'm still, it's getting old, but I'm still kind of emotionally attached to it, and pretty proud of it. I wanted to take it for a spin and a ride to throughout Europe, and my approach was that I wanted to sort of draw a line in the landscape, starting from the very, very north, following the route of E75, more or less, which goes a little bit eastern route from, I think it starts around Vardø in the eastern parts of Finnmark in Norway, and it goes down through Europe on an eastern route, ending up on Crete, actually. So it passes through Athens and all the way to Crete, and Athens was like the destination of the whole trip. And through that trip, I thought it would be interesting to somehow to sort of map the area a little bit as one unity, to think about, you know, what is Europe as an entity, and try and sort of focus less about this nation state borders, and rather try and dive into some kind of narratives along the route that I found interesting. So I was like exploring a lot of material, I guess, processes along the route. For example, when we came to, I was driving on the route with my good colleague Håvard Arnhoff, who's also an architect and an artist, and I think we spent like 4 weeks on the route. But our first like real sort of creative stop was in Riga in Latvia, where we actually had to fix a broken door of our car. So we got a brand new white car standing out on the red chassis of the car, and we took that old red door with us on the route, not really knowing what we were going to do with it. But when we then, after having like 3 or 4 different stops, meeting different kind of, I guess, culturally marginalized situations and groups of people, we ended up in a place in Transylvania called Patarut, which is it's actually a favela, like a ghetto. It's a group of I think it's 800 people that's basically living on the dump in a Romanian big city, a part of European Union. It was like a quite of an intense experience that was very shocking to us, to experience this radical poverty struck community in the middle of European Union, where people were actually living off of scavenging the trash. They were living the trash that came through that area. So they were like really existing on the low level of the material flow cycle, you could say.
Right.
And that's a part of another project that's also, of course, finding its way into my practice. But it was like a really challenging situation, and I felt in some ways, you know, a bit alienated to it, and all our ideas to maybe make some photographies and do some video shooting just sort of, it felt wrong to do it. It felt like we were, you know, there was this sort of cultural gap between where we came from and what we experienced that felt, it felt really insensitive to sort of start imposing too much on it. So what we ended up doing to do, which was some kind of film interaction, was actually to take that car door and hand it over to a guy that we had met during we were there for a week or something, meeting different people in the community and having conversations. And we met one guy that was, his profession was to make ovens for the community there. And he made ovens just with tinkering, just with this like, you know, a metal scissor and no electric tools at all. So it's all like hammer and metal scissors that he created ovens with. So he was like looking for thin metal plates to make his produce from. And then our car door was perfect, it seemed. And so we did kind of a collaboration where we for a day were working with him. He was teaching us how to do it, and we brought in also some reindeer antlers that I had brought in the car that we incorporated into the design. So they became the legs of the oven. So we made this like, this kind of cultural hybrid makeshift oven, which now exists actually in Bergen Kunsthall, and it was also used in the same car when I was doing this TV show production, the post-capitalistic architecture TV. So, so my point is that the whole trip was a little bit about investigating this sort of flows of chance, if you could say, these flows of materials, and also trying to embrace, the unplanned of the whole thing, and letting all these like coincidences and this like personal meetings with people along the journey sort of be the conceptual narrative of the project that we then ended up presenting in Athens. So the oven was one part, and this was just an example of maybe 5 or 6 very similar sort of processes that we initiated without not really knowing where we were going, but letting sort of the journey inform the whole process and the meetings. So.
Yeah, what we were talking about also yesterday is I was thinking about how, what a lot of your work does is it creates these spaces where people can learn from one another, and how that in and of itself might be a kind of decolonial act in my mind. But we were also talking about, this interest that you have in, I would say, not only exposing power structures, which certainly your work does, but shifting them. And I was thinking that the way that you do it is actually not by inverting them. Inverting them seems like the kind of natural way, but it's actually dispersing them. And it's kind of like constant dispersal of what you do, of also I think the sharing and dispersing of knowledge, the ways in which, the way I understand your practice now is a kind of accumulation, and then a kind of reformation, and then kind of another gathering and accumulation. So to me, that's kind of that is very powerful, because it makes me think of even what older forms of consensus were in our communities, how we're trying to bring that back where I'm from at the moment too, where we're kind of working through these clan structures, where now our governance is based the way that it always was, where you kind of had a clan person who would listen to everyone, and then those are the people who kind of work in this other kind of form of democracy. But I like that idea of dispersal as a kind of technique, and because then when you've dispersed things, it's really hard to control it in a way. And I think that that's always been the struggle with the way that, or the threat, I think sometimes, that nomadism entertains to colonial governments. And I think that that's why, there might be this current restrictions on reindeer herding, for example, because it's another form of like the uncontrollable dispersiveness. So I think you and I have long been interested in the kind of technique of nomadism. And I wonder if there's a relationship there between that idea of dispersal and the sort of sense of nomadism.
Yeah, this is such an interesting topic, and I think, and as you pointed out, I think it can be a little bit tricky one as well. I think, and also, like, I sometimes like to use a bit sort of simple and more, I guess, more sort of open definitions or words, and giving space for the unplanned, for example, is something that I've been, sort of talking about and trying to sort of introduce as concepts in my practice, and it's and it always leads to a lot of, I guess, kind of friction friction-filled communication with, especially the institutions that I collaborate with, and I totally understand that. I'm really sort of humble towards that. You know, I understand that it can be a frustrating thing, you know, to sort of, for an institution that is like really dependent on planning and making schedules and having some sort of a foreseeable kind of process taking place, to introduce that, to have sort of me trying to sort of create a space that contains something different, that gives space for something that is, in my opinion, trying to embrace a more holistic, height sensitive kind of process, where, for example, the unheard elements can become heard or seen, and that is something that's always challenging for me. And when you talk about this references to, you know, indigenous communities or indigenous thinking, there's some things that I have from back home, but there's also things that I've been really strongly inspired by in my travels, especially to Canada, and, you know, doing work at the Banff Center, for example, where both you and me have been a couple of times, and there's something with this tradition of the talking circle, for example. And I remember we were introduced to by an elder of the Stoney Dakota Nation when we were working in Banff. Banff is located on their traditional territory, and he was basically introducing me to the concept of the talking stick. So sitting in a circle, having a talking stick, which happened to be a pen, because that's the only sort of object that we had there that was sort of could serve as a stick. And we were all sort of sending that stick around in a circle with everyone, among everyone present, and giving space to absolutely everyone to speak. And at first it seemed maybe a little bit like, almost like, maybe, I think some people thought it was maybe a little bit like child, you know, like primary school like thing to do, but it turned out to really open up the circle and to give voice to something that's created a much more of a kind of a fuller conversation, I think. Because even if people that got that stick didn't have anything to say, they were sort of forced to maybe listen a little bit deeper inside themselves to see if there were something to say. And it always is. There's always feelings and perspectives in everyone, and I think that those kind of experiences has also sort of followed me a little bit. And I think that I think I see it as my role in my art practice to at least try to create those creative processes that also can sort of give space for something more something more silent, or something more sensitive. Because for some reasons, the bigger the institutions are, the harder these sort of hierarchical processes are managed. I'm interested in challenging that, but as you said, not necessarily attacking it, but trying to find a way to make it wider, to open it up.
Yeah, like one of the critiques that you've had, even about, you know, these symbols of Saminess that you say that manifest is they often are incredibly static. It's like when things become institutionalized, that's actually one of the conditions of institutionalization is its increasingly static nature and a kind of dependency on that. There's this amazing story that Richard Hill, a Cree scholar, shared at a conference once that's really stuck with me, and I think you might have been there. He was describing in the 1970s, as part of kind of Native self-determination movement, particularly in health and within the context of universities, the need, or the felt need, to create Indigenous spaces. And so what the solution was for this one space for Indigenous people to gather was actually to take the teepee, which is very similar to the lavu. It's meant to be, you know, placed where you are at a certain moment. It might be really good hunting grounds in the winter, and there's a kind of they're part of what's called like a plurilocal kind of way of being, in that your sense of homeland, while it's dispersed, you still have a very clear idea of where you're going to go, right? And clear idea of territory. So it took the teepee, which is, you know, a skin home that you can travel with, and they made it out of concrete. So they took the absolute essence of something that was always meant to be kind of modular and, you know, institutionalized it. And no one at the time kind of saw the irony in that. And I thought that that was really fascinating, because I think at the same time, probably the same decade, in the 1970s, there were, you know, cropping up these kind of symbols of Saminess, and this, and you give this amazing talk where you kind of show how they formed as part of shopping malls and even, you know, parliaments, for example. And I think that what was missing was, of course, the very sensibility of them, and that was to always be on the move.
Mm.
So yeah, we have our concrete teepees as well.
That's true. Yeah, I think I'm seeing some like a hotel or a motel, roadside motel somewhere in Arizona when we were doing this road trip there. Fascinating.
Yeah, there's that one, and those are actually all made out of concrete, and they were made for tourists. But one of the things that comes with that too is we get incredibly attached to them. You know, I don't think that there's like an all-out rejection of them. People, you know, as Indigenous people, we also like them.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I think that we were just talking about that the other day, and there was someone asking me like, so what would the Samis design? What would they ask for if they were, you know, asked themselves and got to decide themselves? And it's kind of a bit, it's not my favorite answer to give, but I kind of think that a lot of the proposals that would appear would be these giant teepees or lavus, actually. But that doesn't matter, and that's not really, for me, like, that's not really the core of the conversation. I think the core of the conversation is to create an awareness around how we represent ourselves through architecture. And by doing that, I think we're also creating awareness about what architecture is and how architecture actually informs our lives. Architecture is has such a tremendous impact on, you know, how we shape ourselves as a culture, and how we also project ourselves towards the future and what we want to be like, where we want to reach. You know, that's what architecture does. And I think that my main intention and my sort of main hope for, or motivation for doing all this, trying to create all this commotion and conversations, is exactly that: is to make people on a general level just be a bit more aware, be a little bit more critical to what's happening around them. And, you know, it's not about sharing the same opinion. It's not about you know, deconstructing our built society and move away from the use of symbols. Not at all. I believe in indigenous cultures. We're really proud of our symbols, and I think the aesthetics that come out of that is amazing. And I would never, you know, never sort of try to ridicule or get rid of that. I'm just really interested in awareness and education about these topics. It's quite tremendous how architecture is, to which extent it's neglected in the public conversation everywhere. And I think that this is a good approach to have within indigenous communities, to talk about these things.
Yeah. It makes me think, you know, what you've done is, in some ways, draw our attention to those things that we might take for granted a bit. You know, the small things, the things that kind of, as you say, like different design solutions, of which architecture is one. It's also part of our heritage. I feel like what you've gathered in the exhibition Yesterday I was thinking of it as an archive, but I think that's wrong, actually. I think that it is more like a library, a kind of library of ideas, of all of these things that you've gathered, including collaborators, and then the ability of sharing these freely, so that others, can learn from them or even transform them. Um, and I think that that's interesting because that's not necessarily, forming a library is different than a kind of what we might think of restitution, or even a kind of repatriation, because these things never went away. Repatriation assumes that they kind of went somewhere. I think what you're doing instead is a kind of gathering, creating a kind of locus for them, that keeps growing and then kind of, disperses again and comes together again. So I was kind of curious whether you think of it in that way, whether that's kind of and if it's a library, what are the systems in place? Is there systems of borrowing? Is there, things like that? Adding.
Yeah, I think that there's two things I want to at least address to your question. I think one of them is the fact that both of my parents are teachers. So I grew up with two teachers at home, and as most teachers, they were really praising the ethics of pedagogy, I guess you could say. So. Mm-hmm. So I think I was raised with this awareness towards pedagogy, and also I was taught to praise teaching and pedagogy as something very valuable and something generous and important. That education is the key to a success level of a society. These kind of phrases that it came with my mother's milk in a way. So I think that this level, this aspect of pedagogy is running very deep through all my projects, and I'm quite interested in working pedagogically with architecture and creating space and installation where people can find their own way, because I believe if you really want to do good pedagogy, you got to sort of empower the student, or I don't know if student is the right word, but the viewer to really find their own way and sort of engage in it and sort of make up their mind themselves. I think this very sort of didactic, hard way of teaching is something that that's not the concept in the culture where I was raised, and so I really believe in pedagogy as an element in the art, and then there was another thing which I forgot.
That's okay. We were thinking of your work as a kind of library. And, then what are the conditions for borrowing? What are the conditions for, things entering the collection, for example?
Yeah. So I think that that's another sort of aspect about a lot of the things I'm doing. I'm moving very fast from sort of between ideas and projects in a way. So I like to think about, when I was an art student, I was much better at sketching than drawing for some reason. When I moved the pencil fast, I felt like I was really hitting a lot better nerves, and I made a lot better work. And I think that I kind of still do the same when I create space. If I work too long on sort of creating and refining a project, I feel like I lose some of that dynamic energy that I thrive in. So that's why these, for example, the Sami Architecture Library installation, it has a cartotheque. It is kind of a possibility to take out books, but I haven't really gotten there yet, because instead of sort of refining and producing the library as a real library, I guess I'm sort of content with just sort of suggesting the idea of a library existing and letting people engage with it a bit freely, and then hopefully in the future sometime maybe someone else could help me sort of create more of a structured system around it, because that is the intention. That is the intention, that that this library somehow will be permanently installed somewhere and accessible as a real library.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the conditions is that it has to be, modular. And it reminds me, I don't know if I ever shared this project with you. It's an older project based in Honduras, and it's called Biblio de Burro, and it's a library of kids' books that travels on the back of a donkey. And part of the reason for using the donkey, of course, is because it's incredibly nimble in going into these very remote areas. And it was also a way of making, the arrival of books one of the most exciting things to happen in that community. Because in communities where there's not a lot of access to, and there's kind of lower literacy rates. And I always thought that was, really brilliant. Again, like using things that everyone uses on an everyday life, but just, changing them a bit. And, also making that particular donkey into a kind of superhero, which is amazing.
I remember that project.
Yeah, it was Marissa Jean and other collaborators who did that. And I think that it's just a really good example of how, you can, this sort of like space of invention is so incredibly broad no matter where you are. This was quite a while ago, but go ahead. Do you want to say something?
I think that's it also sort of resonates with this thing that we talked about, dealing with nomadism quite a bit. And I think that there's something about there's something about this like misunderstood understanding of nomadism within the world of architecture, where nomadism very often is thought about as something, sightless, generic, universal, like some kind of Macintosh product floating between different type of airports, without really ever landing. Well, in my sort of cultural grounded understanding of nomadism, the term of nomadism is something very opposite. It's like something extremely site specific. It's something that really, like that donkey, that really sort of, it's in my culture, it's like something that really draws from the land, and it's something that has this the architecture of nomadism has this strong connection to the land, because there's so little that's sort of brought from one side to another when you move, that when you come to a new place, you're really, really dependent on your creative capacity to actually source out the materials that you need on the place to build the architecture, or to understand the landscape in terms of, avoiding wind and snow conditions and position yourself within the landscape. There's this understanding of both material resources and landscape. It is quite the opposite in a way. So it is this very site-specific and site-dependent sort of relationship that I always think about when I think about nomadism and the aesthetics and concept of nomadic architecture here in the north. So yeah.
No, I'm glad you said that, because I've always felt exactly the same. That to be nomadic means that you absolutely have to have an intimate knowledge of the place where you are and the place where you're going. And because otherwise, there's no way that you could do what you need to do, as you say. So, and the other thing is, of course, that everyone has a very specific trajectory within that. It's almost like this kind of like web of relations gets made between yourself, the land, animals that you're working with, or you're kind of who you depend upon, and in a way they depend upon you, especially reindeer, for example. That's a very contingent relationship. I think that it's an incredibly deep knowledge, a much deeper knowledge than, say, you might need if your kind of scale of the place where you live is more limited. I think that a lot of your practice does that. It kind of goes against a lot of assumptions, and some of those assumptions I think are I like to kind of read them against kind of like what you might consider colonial anxieties. I think a major colonial anxiety is this kind of like constant search for authenticity. And a story that I really loved that you shared with me is the story of this Greenlandic drum that entered a museum collection. And with that, in entering that collection, there was the replication of drawing kind of symbols of a Sami drum on top of this other drum. And what the drum became was a kind of example of not only extreme lack of knowledge, but I think that kind of invention of authenticity, which I always kind of find fascinating. This is what museums are always doing. It's kind of inventing authenticity, I think, because maybe there's a concern that in Western society they're losing that sense somehow. Maybe that's where some of that anxiety comes from. I always think of, these kind of restrictions that are placed on Indigenous people. If you read them against the grain, like the Reindeer Act, for example, you can read those as kind of documents of colonial anxiety. That's the way that I read also, the Indian Act in Canada and all of its various amendments. In the 1920s, it was illegal if you were a Native man to go to a pool hall. And I think, what was so threatening then to them about a Native man entering a pool hall? And so all of these things get kind of projected onto in these kind of legislations as a kind of form of control. But wherever there's forms of control, there's always ways to subvert them as well, right? So I see that in your work is always a kind of push against this fixes, how authenticity wants to fix something in a place. And as soon as you sort of strive for defining what might be authentic, there's always going to be something that ruptures it, which I always think is fascinating too.
Yeah, exactly. It's very it can like take it. It's always so sort of dual in a way to approach these things, because to sort of, if you sort of too directly in an angry way channeling your frustration right at the sort of power structure and the sort of colonial power itself, I feel that, and that maybe it's a personal thing, I always feel that I sort of lose myself as an artist, and I become something, I become a voice that I don't sort of feel that confident and comfortable in, I guess. I feel like I reduce myself from being this sort of creative, bit social, experimental thinker and creator, and become some just like a half-assed shitty politician that has don't really sort of own the word, or I don't feel like I have this I guess this capacity anymore, and I guess I also in a way start hating myself a little bit after a while. And it is really hard to have, these kind of opinions. And it's really hard to stay in them, because there's always, like, when you have these strong opinions, there's always all these other opinions that you also have to have, sort of tries to eat you. And for me, it has become really important to sort of insist on maintaining this, this like rather confusing, a little bit maybe distorting type of projects and voices, instead of going very directly at the sort of power structure. But obviously, looking at history and colonial history, there's like the example of the drum, for example. It's such a crazy story as a Sami to see how this kind of colonial Norwegian museum institutions have, sort of created the history of the Sami people in the way they want it. They're like acting like this disrespectful, godlike creatures that are, doing something as brutal as that, of course, it makes me really, really angry. It makes me so upset. And it's not, it's, you know, it's only 150 years ago this happened. And I cannot start, you know, explaining my sort of emotional feelings towards it. But then again, that's maybe not the way out of it. That's not maybe the way forward in a way. I feel like maybe other people in the, for example, the Sami society can have those sort of perspectives. But yeah, I totally feel you. I totally. Yeah, they're really big topics and interesting and complex. But I really believe in a sort of creating some sort of a nuanced polyphony.
Yeah, polyphony. Yeah.
Set of narratives in these towards this to as a way of approaching these colonial histories.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's not one way forward. We all can turn our back and look at it and agree about the abusive aspect of them. But I'm also interested in sort of moving ahead at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, one of the things of concentrating on that drum is kind of exposing the falsity of those narratives, but also, you know, whatever their desire was to kind of invent a history, right? And as soon as we start to see histories as invented narratives, I think it opens up things very differently as well,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, yeah. And I think that always, you know, you're kind of working within this kind of space of potentiality, this space of invention. One last point or topic I wanted to open up was a conversation that you were having. You were thinking of the idea of scales of colonialism. And this was in the spring before your exhibition opened. And I was curious, you know, what your thinking is on that now. Is that something that you're still interested in? How do you define it? It's a very different idea. Like what I've been thinking about lately is types of colonialism, like almost creating a taxonomy. So one might be extractive colonialism, which, you know, is enacted through oil and gas and various mining, which is different than settler colonialism, but that has its own kind of fixity. So I'm kind of I'm interested in this idea of scales.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think, and also, you know, we could kind of I could sort of could answer that in different ways. But I think in one way, it's a bit interesting to think about what's right in front of us, which is sort of the different narratives that you and me and our people have experienced in a colonial historical sense. And I think that, you know, there's something about the I think Matthias Dumbold writes about it in the text that's in my that's produced for the book that's coming as a part of the exhibition project in Bergen. And I think it's something he refers to as the seawater effect, which is a sort of historical tendency to identify colonial narratives through the distance between the colonizer and the colonized object. And the distance between Europe and North America is a big one. And that, you know, the date 1492 and sort of the arrival of the Europeans to your continent is something that historically is more identifiable than colonial narrative that exists within the Nordic countries and the Sami people. You know, we share the same land body. The borders surrounding the Sami state, or this Sapmi as a land entity or a cultural entity, has never really been defined. And it's hard to sort of say when colonization started. And there still is, to this very date, people that are, opposing and rejecting the idea that Sápmi as a nation, as a culture, is colonized, right? So,
yeah.
So speaking or answering your question about scale, that might be one way of actually also addressing it. That there are all these colonial sort of narratives in the floating around in the world, and I think that particularly in our situation as Samis, we have, we've been experienced being sort of written out of the Nordic colonial history because, well, it's such a kind of complex, it's such a complex narrative because you can't as easily, pinpoint the colonial era of the Danish Norwegian state or the Swedish state as sort of colonizing the northern areas of Finnmark, while the same nation, the Danish Norwegian state, where you can really easily pinpoint there, the timeline when they went to Greenland or when they went to the Caribbean islands to colonize. So that's much easier, sort of, I guess, maybe easy is not the right word, but it's more identifiable sort of perspective to start building things from, and that's it's a very complex and challenging thing for us to constantly have to deal with in Sápmi. That the history hasn't sort of, I feel like almost the history hasn't been written clearly yet, although that's not true.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And also because often our histories as Indigenous people are at least initially authored by others, and there's so much misinformation in that authoring. But what was really fascinating to me was that idea of proximity and distance that he was speaking about, the idea that somehow colonialism doesn't exist unless it's at a distance and you have to cross a sea. But the kind of, that it can't be a kind of proximate practice or a near practice, which is, as we know, definitely not true. One story I'll share before we close, and maybe speaking about protecting ourselves from that distance, but when the Russians were first arriving on the shores of what's now the northwest coast of Canada, the way that we witnessed their ships was we made kind of binoculars with leaves so that we could shield our eyes. The leaves would somehow protect us from, their arrival, which I thought was quite nice. So maybe we all need glasses now.
We do need glasses. Decolonizing glasses. I think it's really about perspectives, and it's really about being able to see and teaching each other how to see, and that's such an important task for all of us, and it's really a collective task. And I see things happening, but it's going really slowly.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the amazing conversation, inspiring, as always. And also, of course, the words on how we continue.